Sometimes, the loneliest people find each other in the most unexpected ways. In a forgotten frontier town, where winter seems to last forever, old Sheriff Emmett Graves has been eating his meals alone for longer than he cares to remember. The railroad passed his town by, and so did most everyone else, leaving him to keep the peace in a place that's all but given up on itself. One snowy morning, a hungry German shepherd limps into view and stops right in front of Emmett's bench. The dog doesn't beg or bark. He just sits there with quiet dignity, as if politely asking if there's room at the table for one more. What Emmett does next surprises even himself, and what follows is a friendship that gives both of them something worth waking up for. But when a drifter arrives claiming the dog belongs to him, Emmett faces an impossible choice between what's legal and what's right. Can an old lawman find the courage to break his own rules for the sake of true companionship? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty main street of Cedar Ridge, painting the weathered wooden storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Sheriff Emmett Graves sat on his usual bench outside the jailhouse, the same spot he'd occupied every morning for the past 3 years, ever since the town had started its slow fade into memory. His weathered tin plate rested on his knees, containing the same breakfast he'd eaten for longer than he cared to count: beans and cornbread. Simple fare that filled the belly without requiring much thought or preparation. At 68, Emmett had settled into routines that marked the passing days like notches on a prisoner's cell wall. Wake at dawn, brew coffee on the small stove in his office, eat breakfast on the bench while watching the sun climb over the distant mountains, then patrol the nearly empty streets until evening brought him back to his solitary quarters above the jail. The routine had become both comfort and cage, a way to structure time that otherwise seemed to drift by without purpose or meaning. The sheriff's badge on his chest had lost much of its shine over the years, the silver star tarnished by time and neglect. Once that badge had meant something: respect, authority, the weight of responsibility for a thriving community. Now it felt more like an heirloom, a reminder of what used to be rather than what was. But Emmett wore it every day nonetheless, partly from habit and partly from a stubborn belief that someone needed to keep watch, even if there was precious little left to watch over. Cedar Ridge had been a different place when he'd first pinned on that badge 22 years ago. The main street had bustled with activity, merchants hawking their wares, children running between the shops while their mothers conducted business, cowboys and travelers stopping to water their horses and stock up on supplies. The saloon had stayed open until well past midnight, filled with laughter and music and the occasional disagreement that required the sheriff's intervention. Those had been good days, purposeful days, when Emmett had felt like a vital part of something larger than himself. The railroad had changed everything. For years, there had been talk, promises, surveys, and meetings about the great iron horse that would connect Cedar Ridge to the larger world beyond the mountains. The townspeople had invested their hopes and their savings in that dream, believing that progress would bring prosperity. Instead, when the railroad company finally made their decision, they chose a route 50 miles to the south, through easier terrain and more established towns. Cedar Ridge was left behind, forgotten, a small dot on a map that led nowhere important. The exodus had been gradual at first, then swift. Young families packed their belongings and followed the railroad to new opportunities. Merchants closed their shops and moved to towns with better prospects. Even the circuit preacher had stopped coming regularly, his flock scattered to the winds. Now Cedar Ridge was home to perhaps 30 souls, most of them too old, too poor, or too stubborn to start over somewhere else. Martha Henley still ran the general store, though her inventory had dwindled to basic necessities and the occasional luxury that took months to sell. Her husband, Doc, had been the town physician for over 30 years, and while his patient load had diminished considerably, the remaining residents still needed his services from time to time. Father Miguel maintained the small Catholic church at the east end of town, holding Mass every Sunday for a congregation that could fit comfortably in 2 pews. These were Emmett's people now, the remnants of a community that had once been vibrant and full of hope. He felt responsible for them in a way that went beyond his official duties as sheriff. They were family, bound together by shared loss and mutual dependence, survivors of a dream that hadn't quite died, but had certainly grown pale with age. This particular morning started like any other, with Emmett settling onto his bench and watching the steam rise from his coffee cup in the crisp mountain air. The winter had been harsh, laying a blanket of snow over the town that made it look even more deserted than usual. The cold had driven most folks indoors, and Emmett often went days without seeing another soul on the streets. He was halfway through his breakfast when he noticed the dog. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the buildings across the street, a glimpse of brown and black fur that could have been a trick of the light. But then the animal stepped into full view, and Emmett set down his fork to get a better look. It was a German shepherd, or mostly one, with the classic pointed ears and intelligent eyes of the breed. The dog was thin, not starving, but clearly underfed, and there was something about the way it carried itself that spoke of dignity despite its circumstances. The dog stopped in the middle of the street and looked directly at Emmett. There was no desperation in that gaze, no pitiful begging or aggressive posturing. Instead, there was a quiet question, a polite inquiry that seemed to say, "Might there be room for one more at your table?" Emmett had always been fond of animals, though he and his late wife Sarah had never owned any pets. Sarah had been allergic to most fur-bearing creatures, and after she'd passed 5 years ago, Emmett had never considered getting a companion. His grief had been too fresh, his daily routines too firmly established to accommodate another living being that would depend on him for care and attention. But something about this dog's approach struck him as different. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, and a patience that suggested the animal understood that good things sometimes required waiting. The dog didn't approach the bench directly, but instead settled onto its haunches about 10 feet away, maintaining what felt like a respectful distance while making its presence known. Emmett studied the animal while he finished his coffee. The dog's coat was matted and dirty, but underneath the road dust and brambles, he could see hints of the rich coloring that suggested good breeding. One of the animal's front paws was favoring the other slightly, indicating some minor injury or soreness from traveling. Despite its obvious hardships, the dog maintained an erect posture and alert expression that spoke of training and discipline. "You're a long way from anywhere, aren't you, boy?" Emmett said softly, his voice carrying easily across the quiet street. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and its tail moved just slightly, not quite a wag, but an acknowledgement that communication had been established. The animal remained in position, neither advancing nor retreating, as if waiting for some signal about what was expected or permitted. Emmett looked down at his plate, where half his breakfast remained. The beans had cooled somewhat, but they were still perfectly edible, and the cornbread was fresh from Martha's oven. He'd been eating alone for so long that sharing seemed like a foreign concept. But something about the dog's patient dignity made the decision easy. Standing slowly, his knees weren't what they used to be, especially in the cold. Emmett walked to the edge of the boardwalk and set his plate down on the ground. Then he stepped back and returned to his bench, curious to see what the dog would do. For a long moment, neither moved. The dog looked at the plate, then back at Emmett, as if seeking permission or confirmation that this wasn't some kind of test or trick. When Emmett nodded slightly and gestured toward the food, the dog rose gracefully and approached with careful, measured steps. The animal ate with the same dignity it had shown in its approach, not gulping the food desperately, but consuming it with deliberate appreciation. Between bites, the dog would look up at Emmett, as if offering thanks or checking to make sure the arrangement was still acceptable to the man who had provided this unexpected kindness. "Ain't proper to eat alone anyhow," Emmett murmured. echoing words his wife used to say when she'd invite strangers to join them for dinner during their early years of marriage. Sarah had believed that food was meant to be shared, that meals were sacred times when people connected with each other and acknowledged their common humanity. When the dog finished eating, it didn't immediately run off as Emmett had expected. Instead, it carried the empty plate back to the edge of the boardwalk and set it down gently, then returned to its original position in the street. The gesture was so deliberate, so mannerly, that Emmett found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Well, I'll be," he said aloud, genuinely impressed by the animal's behavior. This was no ordinary stray dog, but a creature that had clearly been taught manners and respect. Someone had invested time and care in training this animal, which raised questions about how it had ended up wandering the streets of a dying town in the middle of winter. As the morning progressed, Emmett went about his usual routine of checking the few businesses that remained open and walking the perimeter of town. To his surprise, the dog followed at a discreet distance, never getting too close but never losing sight of the sheriff. It reminded Emmett of the way a good deputy might shadow a senior officer, close enough to provide assistance if needed, but far enough back to avoid being intrusive or presumptuous. By noon, when Emmett returned to the jailhouse for his midday meal, the dog had taken up residence on the shaded side of the building. Curled up on an old horse blanket that someone had left behind years ago, the animal wasn't presuming to enter the building or make itself fully at home, but it had clearly decided that this was where it wanted to be. That evening, as Emmett prepared for bed in his small quarters above the jail, he could hear the dog moving around outside, not restlessly, but with the purposeful movements of an animal settling in for the night. When he looked out his window, he could see the dim outline of the creature lying beside the front door of the jailhouse, positioned like a sentry, keeping watch over the building and its occupant. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Emmett fell asleep, feeling like he wasn't entirely alone in the world. And outside, under the vast expanse of star-filled sky, a faithful dog kept watch through the night, as if protecting something precious that had finally been found after a long and difficult journey. 3 days into their unusual partnership, Emmett decided the dog needed a proper cleaning. The animal had been sleeping beside the jailhouse each night and following him on his rounds each day, maintaining that same respectful distance while clearly establishing itself as a permanent fixture in the sheriff's routine. The dog had shown no interest in wandering off or exploring other parts of town. Seeming content to orbit around Emmett like a loyal satellite, Martha had commented on the arrangement when Emmett stopped by the general store for supplies. "That's a fine-looking dog you've got there, Sheriff," she'd said, her eyes twinkling with the first real warmth he'd seen from her in months. Been a long time since anyone in this town had a proper companion. The observation had struck Emmett more deeply than he'd expected. He hadn't realized how much his mood had improved over the past few days, how much easier it had become to face each morning knowing that someone or something was counting on him to show up. The dog's presence had given structure and purpose to routines that had begun to feel hollow and automatic, but the animal's matted coat and the small cuts on its paws were clear signs that it had been traveling rough for some time. Emmett had noticed the dog favoring its left front paw more pronounced than before, and there were burrs and tangles in its fur that needed attention. If this creature was going to be his companion, then it deserved proper care. He'd filled a large metal tub with warm water behind the jailhouse, using soap that Martha had given him, along with an old brush that had once been used for grooming horses. The dog had submitted to the bath with the same patient dignity it showed in everything else, standing still while Emmett worked the soap through its coat and gently untangled the mats that had accumulated during its travels. It was while working on a particularly stubborn tangle near the dog's neck that Emmett's fingers encountered something unexpected: leather hidden beneath the thick fur. His heart skipped a beat as he carefully parted the hair to reveal what he'd found: a collar. Old worn leather that had been nearly hidden by the dog's thick winter coat and the accumulated dirt of the road. The collar was well made, crafted from quality leather that had been oiled and cared for before the animal had begun its wandering. And stamped into the leather, barely visible but still legible, was a name, Rex. Below the name, in smaller letters, was an address, Millfield Ranch. Sweetwater County. Emmett sat back on his heels, his hand still dripping with soapy water, and stared at the collar. Sweetwater County was nearly 200 miles south of Cedar Ridge, a journey that would have taken the dog weeks to complete on foot, especially if it had been traveling alone and foraging for food along the way. The presence of the collar changed everything. It meant the dog belonged to someone, had a home and a family that were probably looking for it. The animal, Rex, looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, as if sensing that something significant had been discovered. There was no recognition in the dog's expression when Emmett spoke the name aloud, no tail wagging or excited response that might indicate the animal remembered being called by that name. Instead, Rex simply continued to regard him with the same calm attention he'd shown since that first morning. Emmett dried the dog carefully, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd found. As a lawman, his duty was clear. If an animal had been lost or stolen, it was his responsibility to return it to its rightful owners. The law didn't distinguish between four-legged property and any other kind, and harboring someone else's livestock, even unknowingly, was a serious matter in ranch country. But as he looked at Rex, now clean and dignified in his thick winter coat, Emmett felt a reluctance that surprised him with its intensity. Over the past few days, the dog had become more than just a companion. It had become a reason to get up in the morning, a source of purpose that had been missing from his life for far too long. The thought of losing that connection, of returning to the empty routines that had defined his existence before Rex's arrival, filled him with a kind of dread he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. He spent the rest of the day wrestling with his conscience, going through the motions of his usual patrol, while Rex followed at his customary distance. The dog seemed to sense his distraction, staying closer than usual and occasionally looking up at him with what appeared to be concern. There was something almost human in those moments of connection, as if Rex understood that their relationship had reached some kind of turning point. That evening, Emmett sat on his bench with the collar in his hands, studying the faded lettering in the light of the oil lamp he'd brought outside. He'd written similar reports dozens of times over the years, found property, descriptions, contact information for the rightful owners. It would be simple enough to send a telegram to the sheriff in Sweetwater County, to set in motion the process that would eventually reunite Rex with his original family. But something held him back, some instinct that told him the situation was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. Rex showed no signs of wanting to leave Cedar Ridge, no restless pacing or attempts to continue traveling in any particular direction. If anything, the dog seemed more settled and content than many animals Emmett had encountered in their home territories. There was also the matter of Rex's condition when he'd arrived, thin, injured, clearly having traveled a great distance without proper care or shelter. What kind of owners lost a dog for weeks or possibly months without searching for it? What circumstances had led to Rex making that long journey alone, through dangerous territory where wild animals and harsh weather could easily have claimed his life? The more Emmett thought about it, the more questions arose, and the less comfortable he became with the idea of blindly returning the dog without understanding what had happened. He made a decision that would have surprised his younger self, the by-the-book lawman who had never questioned the clear lines between right and wrong. He slipped the collar into his pocket and decided to keep Rex's identity secret, at least until he could learn more about the circumstances that had brought the dog to Cedar Ridge. Rex seemed to approve of this decision, settling down beside Emmett's bench with a contented sigh and resting his head on his paws. In the lamplight, the dog's coat gleamed with health and cleanliness, and his eyes held the peaceful expression of an animal that had found where it belonged. "Guess you're just going to be sheriff for now," Emmett said quietly. using the nickname that had emerged naturally over the past few days. Until we figure out what's what. The dog's tail thumped once against the ground, the first truly enthusiastic response Emmett had seen from him. It was as if Rex approved of the new name, or perhaps was simply content to leave his past behind and embrace whatever future was being offered. As they sat together in the comfortable silence that had become their evening routine, Emmett realized that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He was no longer simply caring for a stray animal. He was actively concealing evidence and avoiding his legal obligations in order to protect something that had become precious to him. For the first time in years, Sheriff Emmett Graves was willing to bend the law for the sake of something more important than duty. And as he looked at the faithful companion sitting beside him, he found that he had no regrets about that choice. The collar would remain hidden, at least for now, and Rex would remain sheriff, the unofficial deputy who had given an old lawman a reason to believe that some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant challenging everything he'd once thought he stood for. The morning after discovering the collar, Emmett found himself moving through his daily routine with a new sense of purpose that felt almost foreign after years of going through the motions. Sheriff, as he'd begun thinking of the dog exclusively, had taken to the name with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm, responding to it with alert attention and the occasional tail wag that suggested approval of this new identity. Their first training session happened by accident. Emmett had been checking the locks on the abandoned buildings at the far end of Main Street when he noticed Sheriff sitting perfectly still, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with focused attention. Following the dog's gaze, Emmett spotted a family of raccoons that had taken up residence in the old barber shop, clearly visible through the broken window as they rummaged through debris. "Easy, Sheriff," Emmett said quietly, more to test the dog's response than from any real concern about the raccoons. Immediately, Sheriff relaxed his posture but maintained his alert attention, looking back at Emmett as if awaiting further instructions. The level of control and discipline displayed in that simple response told Emmett more about the dog's background than days of observation had revealed. This was an animal that had been professionally trained, accustomed to working with a human partner and taking direction in potentially volatile situations. Over the following days, Emmett began incorporating basic commands into their routine, partly out of curiosity about Sheriff's capabilities, and partly from a growing sense that the dog was capable of far more than simple companionship. The animal's responses were immediate and precise. Sit, stay, heel down, all executed with the kind of reliability that spoke of extensive training and natural intelligence. But it was during one of their evening conversations on the bench outside the jailhouse that Emmett discovered something that changed his perspective on the entire situation. He'd taken to talking to Sheriff during these quiet moments, finding that the dog's attentive silence was somehow more comforting than the empty conversations he'd had with himself for years. "You know, Sheriff," he said one evening as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, "there's something about you that reminds me of my Sarah. She had that same way of listening, like she could hear not just the words but what was underneath them." He paused, surprised by how easily her name had come, how speaking it aloud to Sheriff felt natural rather than painful. For years after her death, mentioning Sarah had been like touching a wound that refused to heal, bringing back all the regret and loneliness that had defined his existence since losing her. Sarah had been the heart of their home, the one who had turned their small house behind the church into a place of warmth and laughter. She'd been a school teacher before their marriage, with a natural gift for understanding children and a patience that extended to everyone around her. Their inability to have children of their own had been a shared sorrow, but Sarah had channeled her maternal instincts into caring for the whole community. Opening their home to anyone who needed a meal or a place to stay. "She would have liked you," Emmett continued, reaching down to scratch behind Sheriff's ears. "Had a soft spot for strays and lost things. Always said there was nothing in this world that couldn't be helped, with a little kindness and patience. The memory brought others flooding back. Sarah tending to injured birds that children brought her, nursing sick calves back to health, taking in travelers who were down on their luck. She'd had an instinct for healing that went beyond medicine, a way of making broken things whole again through simple acts of compassion. It struck Emmett that Sheriff's arrival might have been Sarah's doing somehow, a final gift from beyond to help him find his way back to the man he'd been when she was alive. The thought might have seemed foolish to a younger, more pragmatic version of himself, but at his age, he'd learned to appreciate the mysterious ways that life sometimes provided exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment. The next morning brought their first real test as a team. Emmett was making his usual rounds when he heard raised voices coming from Martha's general store. Through the window, he could see her gesticulating angrily at a man Emmett didn't recognize, a stranger in travel-stained clothes who appeared to be arguing about something on the counter. As Emmett approached the store, Sheriff fell into step beside him, his demeanor shifting from relaxed companionship to alert professionalism. The dog seemed to sense that this was different from their usual peaceful patrol, that the situation might require intervention. Inside the store, Emmett found Martha facing off with a rough-looking man who was demanding credit for supplies, despite having no money and no references from anyone in town. The stranger was growing increasingly belligerent, and Emmett could see the fear in Martha's eyes despite her attempts to stand her ground. "Problem here?" Emmett asked calmly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakable. The stranger turned to face him, and Emmett immediately didn't like what he saw. The man's eyes held the kind of calculating hardness that Emmett had learned to associate with trouble, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was used to getting his way through intimidation rather than persuasion. "Just trying to conduct some business with the lady here," the stranger said, his tone carefully neutral, but with an underlying edge that suggested barely controlled aggression. "Seems she's not inclined to be helpful to a traveler in need." Sheriff had positioned himself slightly ahead of Emmett, not in an aggressive stance, but clearly alert and ready to respond if the situation escalated. The dog's presence seemed to register with the stranger, who glanced down at the animal with a flicker of something that might have been recognition or concern. "Ma'am?" Emmett addressed Martha without taking his eyes off the stranger. "He wants credit for a week's worth of supplies," Martha said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "Won't give his name, has no references, and got hostile when I explained our policy about payment in advance." Emmett nodded slowly, keeping his expression neutral while his mind processed the situation. In his experience, most honest travelers understood and respected local business practices, especially in small towns where trust and reputation were everything. Someone who became aggressive when asked for basic information usually had reasons for wanting to avoid questions. "Well then," Emmett said mildly, "seems like a simple misunderstanding." "Sir, I'm Sheriff Graves. Mind telling me where you're headed and what brings you to Cedar Ridge?" The stranger's hesitation was brief but telling. When he finally spoke, his story came out just a little too smoothly, like something that had been rehearsed but not quite perfected. "Name's Johnson," he said. "Heading north to Montana Territory looking for work. Horse threw a shoe about 10 miles south of here, and I'm hoping to get supplies to see me through to the next town." It was a plausible story, but something about the man's manner set off warning bells in Emmett's mind. Sheriff seemed to share his suspicion, remaining alert and focused on the stranger in a way that suggested the dog sensed something amiss. The interaction ended peacefully enough, with the stranger agreeing to move on without making any purchases. But Emmett found himself thinking about the encounter long after the man had disappeared down the road leading out of town. The encounter with the stranger lingered in Emmett's mind for days afterward, not because of any immediate threat, but because of how naturally Sheriff had responded to the potential danger. The dog's behavior had been that of a trained professional, someone accustomed to reading situations and positioning himself strategically without being given explicit commands. It reinforced Emmett's growing conviction that Sheriff's background involved law enforcement or military service, though the mystery of how such a valuable animal had ended up wandering alone remained unsolved. To occupy his hands during the long evening hours and to give Sheriff something uniquely his own, Emmett decided to carve a whistle. He'd always been handy with wood, a skill learned from his father, who had been a carpenter before taking up ranching. In the small workshop behind the jailhouse, among tools that hadn't been used in years, he found a piece of maple that would serve his purpose perfectly. The work was meditative, requiring patience and precision that reminded him of better times when he'd had projects to complete and reasons to create something lasting. Each evening after supper, he would sit on his bench with Sheriff beside him, carefully shaping the wood while they both enjoyed the comfortable silence that had become their routine. Sheriff seemed fascinated by the process, watching intently as Emmett worked and occasionally sniffing at the wood shavings that accumulated around their feet. The dog's attention was focused and intelligent, as if he understood that something was being made specifically for him and was eager to see the finished product. The carving took nearly a week to complete, partly because Emmett was out of practice and partly because he found himself reluctant to finish it too quickly. The work gave structure to their evenings together, a shared activity that felt purposeful and satisfying in a way that simply sitting together, pleasant as it was, could not quite match. When the whistle was finally complete, smooth and perfectly balanced in his hand, Emmett tested it carefully before offering it to Sheriff. The clear, melodious tone carried easily across the empty street, and Sheriff's ears pricked up immediately at the sound. But rather than responding with excitement or confusion, the dog sat perfectly still, waiting for whatever signal or command the whistle might represent. It became clear during their first training session with the whistle that Sheriff had worked with such signals before. A single sharp blast brought him to immediate attention. 2 short notes meant come, and a long, sustained tone signaled stay or wait. These weren't responses that Emmett had taught him. They were ingrained behaviors that suggested extensive prior training with similar equipment. The discovery was both thrilling and troubling. On one hand, it meant that Emmett had gained a partner whose capabilities far exceeded those of an ordinary pet or even a well-trained ranch dog. Sheriff could follow complex commands, assess situations independently, and respond to subtle signals that would allow them to work together with minimal verbal communication. For an aging sheriff in a town where backup was hours away, such a partner represented security and confidence that had been missing for years. On the other hand, it raised increasingly uncomfortable questions about Sheriff's origins and the circumstances that had brought him to Cedar Ridge. Animals with this level of training didn't simply wander off from their homes. They were valuable assets, carefully maintained and closely supervised. The fact that Sheriff had been traveling alone, apparently for weeks, suggested that something significant had happened to separate him from his original handlers. Doc Henley's examination of Sheriff provided some additional clues, though they only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The dog was in excellent health, despite his recent hardships, with the kind of muscle tone and conditioning that spoke of regular, strenuous exercise. His teeth were clean and well-maintained, suggesting quality care and proper nutrition until relatively recently. Most tellingly, Doc found several small scars on Sheriff's legs and flanks that appeared to be from old injuries, the kind that might result from dangerous work in challenging environments. This is a working dog, Doc concluded after completing his examination. Not just trained, but experienced. Those scars didn't come from farm work or herding cattle. This animal has seen some serious action, probably military or law enforcement. The assessment confirmed what Emmett had already suspected, but it also raised the stakes considerably. If Sheriff was indeed a former military or police dog, then his value would be enormous. and the people looking for him would have resources and determination that went far beyond what ordinary pet owners might possess. The longer Emmett kept Sheriff's identity secret, the more serious the potential consequences became. But as he watched Sheriff interact with the townspeople over the following days, Emmett found it increasingly difficult to imagine giving him up. The dog had brought life back to Cedar Ridge in ways that went beyond simple companionship. Children who had been shy and withdrawn around adults seemed drawn to Sheriff, approaching him with the kind of trust and affection that suggested the dog had a special gift for working with young people. Martha had begun saving scraps from her kitchen specifically for Sheriff, and even Father Miguel had commented on how the dog's presence seemed to lift everyone's spirits. More importantly, Sheriff appeared to have chosen Cedar Ridge as his home. There was no restlessness in his behavior, no indication that he wanted to be anywhere else. He had settled into the rhythms of small-town life with an ease that suggested contentment rather than resignation. And his loyalty to Emmett seemed absolute and freely given. It was during one of their evening training sessions that Emmett noticed the rider approaching from the south. The man was still too far away to make out details, but something about his purposeful manner and direct route toward town suggested this wasn't a casual traveler. Sheriff noticed the rider too, his body tensing slightly as he focused his attention on the approaching figure. As the rider drew closer, Emmett could see that he was well equipped and traveled with the kind of gear that suggested serious business rather than casual wandering. The man's horse was quality stock, well cared for and capable of covering long distances quickly. When he finally reached the edge of town and dismounted in front of the saloon, Emmett got his first clear look at someone who would change everything. The stranger was younger than Emmett, probably in his 40s, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. His clothes were practical and well-maintained, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting results. Most significantly, his eyes swept the street with the systematic attention of someone looking for something specific. When those eyes settled on Sheriff, Emmett saw a flicker of recognition that made his heart sink. The stranger had found what he was looking for, and the peaceful days of shared meals and evening conversations were about to come to an end. The stranger approached with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he came for. Emmett remained seated on his bench, keeping his posture relaxed, while his mind raced through possibilities and preparations. Sheriff had gone rigid beside him, his body language shifting from the relaxed alertness of routine patrol to something approaching alarm. The dog's reaction told Emmett everything he needed to know about the nature of this encounter. "Sheriff Graves?" The man called out as he crossed the street, his voice carrying the kind of practiced authority that suggested law enforcement or military background. "Name's Jake Morrison. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Emmett stood slowly, using the movement to position himself between Morrison and Sheriff while keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. Years of experience had taught him to read dangerous men, and something about Morrison's approach set off every instinct he'd developed during his decades as a lawman. "That depends," Emmett replied evenly, "on what you think I have." Morrison's smile was calculated rather than genuine, the kind of expression that never quite reached the eyes. He gestured toward Sheriff, who had retreated slightly to stand directly behind Emmett's legs, not cowering, but clearly seeking protection. "That's my dog." "Rex," Morrison said, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Got the ownership papers right here, along with a description that matches him perfectly. German Shepherd, about 4 years old, brown and black markings, trained for security work. Been looking for him for weeks." Emmett accepted the papers and examined them carefully, his lawman's eye noting details that might escape casual observation. The documents appeared legitimate at first glance, properly formatted ownership papers with what looked like official stamps and signatures. But something about the paperwork felt wrong, though he couldn't immediately identify what was bothering him. "Says here you're from Millfield Ranch in Sweetwater County," Emmett observed. keeping his voice neutral while his mind worked through the implications. The name matched what he'd found on Sheriff's hidden collar, but that coincidence felt too convenient rather than reassuring. "That's right," Morrison confirmed. "Rex here was part of our ranch security operation. Valuable animal, trained to work with livestock and protect property. When he went missing during a storm a few weeks back, I figured he was probably dead. Heard from some travelers that there was a dog matching his description in this area, so I rode up to check. The story was plausible, delivered with enough detail to sound authentic without being overly elaborate. But Emmett's instincts, sharpened by decades of distinguishing truth from deception, detected inconsistencies that Morrison probably didn't realize he was revealing. "Funny thing," Emmett said, handing the papers back while keeping his tone conversational. "This dog's been here about a week now, and he's never responded to the name Rex. Seems to prefer Sheriff, which is what we've been calling him." Morrison's pause was brief, but telling. "Dogs sometimes forget their names when they've been running wild for a while," he said, his tone suggesting this was common knowledge. "Trauma can do that to animals, make them skittish about their old lives. But he'll remember once he gets back to familiar surroundings." Sheriff's reaction to Morrison's presence was becoming more pronounced as the conversation continued. The dog was now pressed against Emmett's legs, his body trembling slightly in a way that suggested fear rather than excitement about being reunited with his supposed owner. Most dogs, even after weeks of separation, would show some recognition of their master, tail wagging, eager movement, vocalization. Sheriff displayed none of these behaviors. "Mind if I ask how exactly Rex went missing?" Emmett inquired, his sheriff's instincts taking over despite his personal investment in the situation. "Storm damage can be pretty specific in how it affects ranch operations." Morrison's hesitation was longer this time, and when he spoke, his story became slightly more elaborate than before, often a sign that someone was improvising rather than recalling actual events. "Had a lightning strike that spooked the horses," Morrison explained. "Rex was working the perimeter when it happened, and in all the confusion with getting the animals settled, nobody noticed he'd taken off. By the time we realized he was missing, the trail was cold. Been checking towns and ranches ever since, hoping someone had taken him in." The explanation was reasonable, but it felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. More importantly, it didn't account for several things that Emmett had observed about Sheriff's condition and behavior. The dog showed none of the typical signs of storm trauma that Emmett had seen in other animals. No fear of loud noises, no skittishness around sudden movements. If anything, Sheriff demonstrated the kind of steady nerves that came from extensive training and experience in high-stress situations. "Well, Mr. Morrison," Emmett said carefully, "I appreciate you coming all this way to retrieve your animal. But I'm going to need some time to verify your paperwork and make sure everything's in order. You understand, being a lawman, I have to be thorough about these things." Morrison's expression hardened slightly, the friendly facade slipping just enough to reveal something colder underneath. "How long are we talking about, Sheriff? I've got business back at the ranch, and I'd like to get Rex home as soon as possible. Few days, maybe a week," Emmett replied, maintaining his casual tone while making it clear this wasn't negotiable. "Got to send some telegrams, check with the authorities in Sweetwater County, make sure all the documentation is proper. I'm sure you understand the importance of following proper procedures." The standoff stretched for several long moments, with Morrison clearly weighing his options, and Emmett prepared for whatever direction the conversation might take. Sheriff remained pressed against his legs, his breathing quick and shallow in a way that suggested genuine distress about the possibility of leaving with this man. Finally, Morrison nodded, with the kind of forced reasonableness that didn't quite mask his frustration. "Of course, Sheriff. Wouldn't want there to be any irregularities. I'll get a room at the saloon and wait for you to complete your investigation." "Appreciate your patience," Emmett said, though both men understood that patience wasn't really what was being offered or requested. As Morrison walked back toward the saloon, Emmett noticed the way Sheriff tracked the man's movement, his body remaining tense until Morrison disappeared inside the building. Only then did the dog relax slightly, though he continued to stay close to Emmett's side. That evening, as they sat on their usual bench, Emmett found himself facing the most difficult decision of his career. Morrison's claim appeared legally sound, and as a lawman, Emmett's duty was clear. But every instinct he possessed told him that surrendering sheriff to this man would be a mistake, with consequences that went far beyond. Simple property disputes, the crumpled paper he'd glimpsed falling from Morrison's saddlebag as the man dismounted suggested. There was more to this story than legitimate ownership claims, and Sheriff's reaction left no doubt about his feelings regarding a reunion with his supposed master. For the first time in his career, Sheriff Emmett Graves was seriously considering putting his personal convictions ahead of legal obligations. The question was whether he had the courage to follow through on that consideration, and whether he could find a way to protect Sheriff without destroying everything he'd spent his life building. Emmett spent a restless night planning his next moves, his mind working through possibilities and contingencies with the methodical thoroughness that had served him well throughout his career. By dawn, he had decided on a course of action that would either resolve the situation or commit him to a path from which there might be no return. The telegraph office in Cedar Ridge had been closed for 2 years, another casualty of the town's decline, but the nearest functioning office was in Millbrook, a half-day's ride to the east. Emmett made the journey alone, leaving Sheriff in Martha's care with strict instructions to keep the dog inside the store and away from Morrison's attention. The ride gave him time to think through what he knew and what he suspected. Morrison's papers had looked authentic, but Emmett's years of examining documents had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. More troubling was Morrison's demeanor, too controlled, too prepared, like someone who had rehearsed his story rather than someone genuinely relieved to have found a lost pet. At the Millbrook telegraph office, Emmett sent carefully worded messages to 3 different destinations. The first went to the sheriff in Sweetwater County, requesting information about any missing dogs reported in the area and verification of Jake Morrison's connection to Millfield Ranch. The second went to a former colleague who now worked as a territorial marshal, asking for any information about Morrison that might exist in law enforcement files. The third, and most important, went to the Military Records Office, requesting information about any working dogs that might have gone missing from military installations in the past few months. The responses came back over the course of 2 days, and each one added pieces to a puzzle that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The sheriff in Sweetwater County had no record of any missing dog reports from Millfield Ranch, and his inquiry had revealed that the ranch had been abandoned for over a year following the owner's death. No one named Jake Morrison was known to have any connection to the property, though there had been reports of drifters and squatters using the empty buildings as temporary shelter. The territorial marshal's response was even more illuminating. Jake Morrison was indeed known to law enforcement, but not as a legitimate rancher or businessman. He was wanted for questioning in connection with a series of armed robberies across 3 territories, always working alone, and always managing to stay 1 step ahead of pursuing lawmen. The description matched the man currently staying in Cedar Ridge's saloon perfectly, but it was the military response that provided the most crucial information. A German shepherd named Duke, trained for reconnaissance and patrol duties, had gone missing from Fort Carson 3 months earlier when his handler was killed during a training accident. The dog had disappeared from the base immediately following his handler's death and was presumed to have died in the wilderness. The description of Duke matched Sheriff in every detail, down to the small scars that Doc Henley had noted during his examination. Emmett read the telegrams twice, then carefully folded them and placed them in his vest pocket. Everything made sense now. Sheriff's advanced training, his disciplined responses, his obvious familiarity with law enforcement procedures. He wasn't Rex from Millfield Ranch, He was Duke, a military working dog who had been grieving the loss of his partner and trying to find his way home. Morrison's interest in the dog had nothing to do with legitimate ownership and everything to do with the value of a highly trained animal that could be used for illegal activities. A dog with Duke's capabilities would be worth a fortune to someone engaged in robbery or other criminal enterprises, providing reconnaissance, distraction, and even protection during dangerous operations. The ride back to Cedar Ridge gave Emmett time to plan his confrontation with Morrison, but it also forced him to confront the broader implications of what he'd learned. Duke's military service made him federal property, technically belonging to the U.S. Army rather than to any individual. Returning him to his proper owners would mean sending him back to Fort Carson, where he would either be assigned to a new handler or, given his age and the trauma of losing his original partner, might be retired from active service. Neither option guaranteed Duke's happiness or well-being, and both would mean losing the companion who had transformed Emmett's life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The right thing to do, legally and morally, was clear. Expose Morrison as a fraud, contact the military authorities, and arrange for Duke's return to his proper handlers. But as Emmett approached Cedar Ridge and saw Duke waiting for him in front of Martha's store, tail wagging with genuine joy at his return, the right thing became considerably more complicated. The dog's greeting was enthusiastic but controlled. The response of an animal who had been worried about his partner's absence but had maintained discipline in the face of uncertainty. Duke's eyes held an intelligence and emotional depth that went far beyond simple animal affection. This was a creature who had formed a bond based on mutual respect and shared purpose, not mere dependency or convenience. Martha's report on Duke's behavior during Emmett's absence confirmed what he already suspected. The dog had been restless and alert, frequently positioning himself where he could watch the road leading out of town. He had eaten reluctantly and slept fitfully, clearly concerned about Emmett's prolonged absence. Most tellingly, he had shown obvious anxiety whenever Morrison appeared on the street, always seeking shelter inside the store rather than maintaining his usual confident presence. "That animal knows good from bad," Martha observed as she watched Duke settle contentedly beside Emmett's bench. "Whatever that Morrison fellow wants with him, it's nothing good. Dog's got more sense than most people when it comes to judging character." That evening, as Emmett sat with Duke and contemplated his next move, Morrison approached their usual spot with the kind of forced casualness that suggested he was running out of patience with the delay. "Sheriff," Morrison said, his tone carefully neutral, but with an underlying edge that hadn't been present in their first conversation. "Wondering if you've had a chance to verify my paperwork yet? Been thinking I might need to get back to the ranch soon." With or without Rex, the threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Emmett found himself responding to it with the kind of cold anger that he hadn't felt in years. This man was not only a criminal, but someone who would use and abuse an animal that had already suffered enough loss and trauma. "Actually, Mr. Morrison," Emmett replied, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, "I've got some interesting news about your paperwork. Seems there might be some irregularities that need addressing." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tensing that suggested he was preparing for trouble. "Is that right?" Morrison said. "What kind of irregularities?" Emmett smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "The kind that usually end with someone wearing handcuffs." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but Emmett was ready for the response. "I wouldn't," he said quietly, his own weapon half drawn before Morrison could clear leather. "Been doing this a lot longer than you have." "Son." The standoff lasted several tense seconds before Morrison slowly raised his hands, his face showing the calculation of a man weighing his options and finding them all unfavorable. Duke had positioned himself slightly behind Emmett, alert and ready, but not aggressive, the stance of a trained professional waiting for orders. "Now then," Emmett continued, his gun remaining drawn but pointed downward, "let's talk about those irregularities I mentioned. Starting with the fact that Millfield Ranch has been abandoned for over a year, and you're wanted for armed robbery in 3 territories. Morrison's mask of false reasonableness finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. You're making a mistake, old man. That dog is worth more than this whole dead town, and there are people who'll pay good money for him. Walk away now, and you can keep breathing. See, that's where you're wrong, Emmett replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced down dangerous men before and survived. This isn't about money or value. This is about doing what's right. It was then, as Morrison's expression shifted from frustrated anger to something approaching desperation, that Duke made a sound Emmett had never heard from him before, a low, mournful whine that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. The dog was staring at Morrison with an intensity that went beyond simple dislike or fear. "You know something, don't you, boy?" Emmett said softly, not taking his eyes off Morrison, but speaking to Duke with the kind of gentle encouragement that had become natural between them. Duke's response was immediate and dramatic. He moved forward, not aggressively but with purpose, and began pawing at the ground near Morrison's feet. The behavior was deliberate and specific, clearly a trained response to some kind of stimulus that Emmett couldn't immediately identify. "What's he doing?" Morrison demanded, his voice rising with what sounded like genuine alarm. Emmett had seen similar behavior before, years ago, when the territorial marshal had brought a tracking dog to help search for missing evidence in a bank robbery case. The dog had been trained to locate specific scents, and its behavior when it found what it was looking for had been exactly like what Duke was displaying now. "Duke," Emmett said, using the dog's real name for the first time since learning it, "what did you find?" The effect of hearing his actual name was electric. Duke's entire demeanor changed, his tail beginning to wag as he looked up at Emmett with an expression of pure joy and recognition. But he didn't abandon his focused attention on Morrison, instead becoming more insistent in his pawing at the ground. Morrison tried to step back, but Emmett gestured with his gun for the man to remain still. "Don't think I'd move just yet. Seems like Duke here has something to tell us." It was then that Emmett noticed what Duke had been trying to show. Him, partially buried in the dirt near where Morrison had been standing, was a small metal object that glinted in the lamplight. Keeping his gun trained on Morrison, Emmett knelt and carefully excavated what turned out to be a military identification tag. Tarnished with age and wear, but still legible, the tag bore the name Sergeant James Mitchell and a service number that meant nothing to Emmett, but clearly meant everything to Duke. The dog's behavior became even more agitated when he saw the tag, whining and pawing at it with an urgency that spoke of deep emotional significance. "That's Duke's handler's tag, isn't it?" Emmett said, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "The soldier who died in the training accident." Morrison's silence was answer enough, but his face had gone pale in a way that confirmed Emmett's growing suspicions. "Let me guess," Emmett continued, his voice growing harder as understanding dawned. "You were there when Sergeant Mitchell died. Maybe you were even responsible for the accident. And when Duke disappeared afterward, you saw an opportunity to profit from a highly trained military asset." "You don't know what you're talking about," Morrison said. But his voice lacked conviction. Duke was now showing clear signs of distress, his attention fixed on the identification tag with an intensity that made it clear this was more than just recognition of a familiar scent. This was grief, the kind of profound loss that comes from losing someone who meant everything. Emmett carefully picked up the tag, and Duke immediately calmed, settling beside him with his head resting against Emmett's leg. The dog's eyes held a sadness that was almost human in its depth, and Emmett found himself understanding something crucial about their relationship. "You weren't just looking for any military dog, were you, Morrison? You were specifically hunting Duke because you knew he'd witnessed what really happened to his handler. You've been tracking him for months, not because of his value as a trained animal, but because he's the only evidence left of whatever you did at Fort Carson." Morrison's hand twitched toward his gun again, but Emmett was ready. I told you once already, don't. That dog saw something he shouldn't have, Morrison finally admitted, his facade crumbling under the weight of exposure. Mitchell got suspicious about some missing supplies, started asking questions about inventory discrepancies. Had to be dealt with before he could make his report. The confession hung in the air between them, and Emmett felt a cold anger building in his chest. This man hadn't just stolen from the military, he'd murdered a soldier and then spent months hunting the only witness to his crime. So you killed him and made it look like an accident, Emmett said. And when Duke ran off afterward, you realized you had a problem. A trained military dog who might be able to lead investigators back to evidence you'd hidden. Smart dog, Morrison said, his voice taking on a bitter edge. Too smart for his own good. Just like his handler. Duke's reaction to Morrison's words was immediate and visceral. The dog rose to his feet, his body rigid with tension, and for the first time since Emmett had known him, he showed genuine aggression, lips pulled back, teeth bared, a low growl that spoke of fury held barely in check. Easy, boy, Emmett said softly, understanding now why Duke had been so traumatized by Morrison's presence. This wasn't just fear or dislike. It was recognition of his handler's killer. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the confrontation, and Emmett looked up to see 3 riders approaching from the direction of Millbrook. Even in the growing darkness, he could make out the distinctive uniforms of territorial marshals, and his heart sank as he realized what their presence meant. His telegrams had brought more than just information. They'd brought federal attention to Cedar Ridge, and with it, the end of any hope he might have had of keeping Duke as his companion. Sheriff Graves. One of the marshals called out as they dismounted. Marshal Thompson, Territorial Service. We got your telegrams about Jake Morrison and the missing military dog. Emmett holstered his gun as the marshals approached, noting how Duke immediately shifted his attention to the newcomers, but remained calm and controlled. The dog's military training was evident in how he assessed the new arrivals, alert but not alarmed, recognizing fellow law enforcement personnel. Marshal Thompson, Emmett acknowledged. I believe we've got your man right here. Along with some evidence of crimes committed at Fort Carson, Morrison made one last desperate attempt to escape, lunging toward the shadows between buildings. But Duke was faster. The dog intercepted him with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive training in apprehending suspects, bringing Morrison down with minimal force but maximum effectiveness. As the marshals took Morrison into custody, Emmett found himself facing the inevitable conversation about Duke's future. The dog belonged to the army, would need to be returned to military custody, and would likely face an uncertain future without his original handler. But as Duke settled beside him once again, Emmett realized that their story was far from over. The truth about Sergeant Mitchell's death had finally come to light. Justice was being served, and Duke had played a crucial role in bringing his handler's killer to account. The question now was whether an old sheriff and a grieving military dog could find a way to build a new future together, or whether duty and regulations would separate them just as they'd finally learned to trust each other completely. The marshal's camp that night was somber, filled with the kind of quiet conversation that follows the resolution of a long and complicated case. Morrison sat in shackles beside their fire, his earlier bravado replaced by the sullen resignation of a man facing the gallows. The evidence Duke had helped uncover, Sergeant Mitchell's identification tag and Morrison's own confession, would be more than enough to ensure justice for the murdered soldier. Marshal Thompson proved to be a decent man, weathered by years of frontier law enforcement, but still possessed of the kind of fairness that Emmett respected. Over coffee and hardtack, he shared what the federal investigation had revealed about Morrison's activities at Fort Carson and the broader implications of the case. Morrison was part of a supply theft ring, Thompson explained, his voice low enough not to carry to where their prisoner sat brooding. Been skimming weapons, ammunition, even horses from military installations across 3 territories. Sergeant Mitchell stumbled onto the operation by accident when he noticed inventory discrepancies in his unit's equipment records. Emmett listened while Duke lay beside him, the dog's head resting on his boots in a gesture of simple companionship that had become as natural as breathing. The revelation of Morrison's guilt should have brought satisfaction, but instead, Emmett found himself dreading the conversation he knew was coming. "The Army's grateful for what you've done here, Sheriff," Thompson continued. "Without Duke's help, we might never have gotten the evidence we needed to tie Morrison to Mitchell's death. That dog's a hero, no question about it." "He's a good partner," Emmett said quietly, his hand moving automatically to scratch behind Duke's ears. "Best I've ever had." Thompson studied them both for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in the obvious bond that had formed between man and dog. "That's what makes this next part difficult," he said finally. "Army regulations are pretty clear about military working dogs. Duke's federal property, trained at considerable expense, and technically still on active duty, despite being listed as missing." The words hit Emmett like a physical blow, though he'd been expecting them since the Marshal's arrival. He'd known from the moment he learned Duke's true identity that this moment would come, but knowing and accepting were two very different things. "When do they want him back?" Emmett asked, keeping his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "That's the complicated part," Thompson said, pulling a folded telegram from his pocket. "I sent word to Fort Carson about Duke's recovery, expecting standard orders to return him to base. Instead, I got this." Emmett read the telegram twice, his heart sinking with each word. The Army was indeed claiming Duke, but not for continued service. At 4 years old and having lost his handler under traumatic circumstances, Duke was being classified as psychologically unfit for further military duty. He would be returned to base for evaluation and most likely euthanized as a liability. "They're going to kill him," Emmett said, the words coming out flat and emotionless as his mind struggled to process what he was reading. "Standard procedure for military animals that can't be rehabilitated," Thompson confirmed, his own discomfort with the situation evident in his voice. "The Army considers it more humane than trying to retrain a traumatized animal or risking public safety by releasing them to civilian life." Duke seemed to sense the tension in the conversation, lifting his head to look between the two men with the kind of intelligent attention that had become so familiar to Emmett. There was trust in those dark eyes, confidence that whatever was being discussed, his partner would make the right decision. That trust was almost more than Emmett could bear. "There might be an alternative," Thompson said after a long pause. "Unofficial, you understand, and not something I could put in any report." Emmett looked up sharply, hope flickering despite his attempts to keep his expectations in check. "Morrison's escape attempt tonight," Thompson continued carefully. "Say he managed to get away in the confusion, maybe took the dog with him as a hostage. By the time we tracked him down, Duke had disappeared again, probably spooked by the violence. We'd have to report the dog as lost in the wilderness, presumed dead." The implication was clear, and Emmett found himself staring at the Marshal with something approaching gratitude. "That would be a lot of paperwork to lose," he said carefully. "Paperwork has a way of getting misplaced out here," Thompson replied, "especially when it concerns heroes who've earned the right to choose their own retirement." The offer hung between them, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. All Emmett had to do was agree to the deception, and Duke would be free to live out his days in Cedar Ridge, officially dead but actually alive and safe from military bureaucracy. But accepting would mean asking Thompson to falsify official reports, to lie to his superiors, and to risk his own career for the sake of one dog's welfare. It would make Emmett complicit in a federal crime, transforming him from a lawman who bent rules for good reasons into someone who actively broke them. "I need some time to think about this," Emmett said finally, though every fiber of his being was screaming at him to accept immediately. "Of course," Thompson nodded. "We'll be here until morning. Morrison's not going anywhere, and officially, Duke is still missing until I file my report. That night, Emmett sat on his familiar bench with Duke beside him, wrestling with a decision that would define the remainder of both their lives. The dog seemed to understand that something significant was happening, staying closer than usual and offering the kind of quiet companionship that had become their evening routine. The town around them was silent, most residents having retired early after the excitement of Morrison's arrest. Only Martha's store showed any light, a warm glow from her kitchen where she was probably preparing food for the marshal's breakfast. The normalcy of it all, the quiet streets, the familiar buildings, the sense of community that had slowly rebuilt itself around their partnership, made the thought of losing Duke almost unbearable. "What do you think, boy?" Emmett asked softly, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Think an old sheriff and a retired soldier could make a good life together." Duke's tail thumped once against the wooden boards of the bench, a gesture that had become his standard response to direct questions. But there was something different in his expression tonight, an alertness that suggested he understood more of the situation than might seem possible for an animal. As the hours passed, Emmett found himself thinking about Sarah and what she might have advised in this situation. She'd always been his moral compass, the one who helped him navigate the grey areas between legal obligation and human decency. Her voice seemed to echo in his memory, reminding him that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the same as the lawful thing to do. But Sarah had never faced a choice that required breaking federal law or asking others to compromise their integrity. The scale of what Thompson was offering went far beyond the small ethical compromises that defined frontier justice. Dawn was approaching when Emmett finally made his decision. He would accept Thompson's offer, but not in the way the marshal had proposed. Instead, he would take full responsibility for Duke's disappearance, crafting a story that would protect Thompson from any potential consequences, while still achieving the goal of keeping Duke safe. The plan that formed in his mind was risky, requiring precise timing and a willingness to sacrifice his own reputation for Duke's welfare. But as he looked at the faithful companion who had given him a reason to live again, Emmett found that the choice was actually quite simple. He would tell Thompson that Duke had escaped during the night, slipping away while everyone slept. He would report tracking the dog into the wilderness, losing the trail in rocky terrain where footprints couldn't be followed. He would describe a thorough search that turned up no trace of the animal, leading to the reasonable conclusion that Duke had either died of exposure or been killed by predators. The story would be plausible enough to satisfy federal bureaucrats while protecting Thompson from accusations of negligence or complicity. More importantly, it would allow Duke to remain in Cedar Ridge under his assumed identity as sheriff, the unofficial deputy who had helped solve a murder and bring a killer to justice. There would be risks, of course. Someone might recognize Duke despite his new name and circumstances. Federal investigators might decide to conduct their own search for the missing dog. Emmett himself might face charges if the deception was ever discovered. But as he watched the sun rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of Sarah's favorite time of day, Emmett found that he was at peace with his decision. He had spent his entire career following rules and upholding laws, sometimes at the cost of his own happiness, and always with the assumption that duty came before personal desires. For once in his life, he was going to choose love over law, companionship over compliance, and the welfare of a faithful friend over the abstract demands of institutional authority. "Morning, Duke," he said softly as the dog stirred beside him. "Ready to disappear?" Duke looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, and Emmett could have sworn he saw understanding there, not just of the words, but of the sacrifice they represented and the new life they promised. Within the hour, Marshal Thompson would discover that his prisoner's guard dog had vanished without a trace, beginning a search that would officially end with Duke's presumed death in the wilderness. But in reality, it would mark the beginning of a new chapter for both an aging sheriff and a grieving soldier. Two souls, who had found in each other the companionship and purpose they'd thought were lost forever. The climax of their story was about to unfold, and Emmett was finally ready to face whatever consequences his choice might bring. The commotion started just after dawn, when Marshal Thompson discovered that Morrison had somehow managed to slip his bonds during the night. The shackles lay empty beside the cold remains of the campfire, and Morrison himself was nowhere to be found. Even more concerning, Duke had vanished as well. Leaving no trace of his departure, Emmett arrived at the marshal's camp within minutes of Thompson's urgent call, his face showing the appropriate mixture of concern and determination that the situation demanded. Inside, his heart was racing with the knowledge that his plan was already in motion, that the carefully orchestrated deception he'd spent the pre-dawn hours arranging was now becoming reality. "How long has he been gone?" Emmett asked, examining the abandoned shackles with the practiced eye of a lawman who had dealt with escapes before. "Can't be more than a few hours," Thompson replied, his frustration evident in every word. "I had Johnson on watch duty, but he admits he dozed off around midnight. Could have happened any time after that." The other Marshal, Johnson, stood nearby, looking appropriately ashamed of his failure. He was young, probably new to frontier law enforcement, and his obvious distress at allowing a prisoner to escape was genuine enough to deflect suspicion from the real circumstances of Morrison's disappearance. "Any sign of which direction they went?" Emmett inquired, knowing full well that the tracks he'd spent 2 hours creating in the pre-dawn darkness would lead toward the rocky hills north of town. Thompson pointed toward the maze of boulders and ravines that stretched for miles beyond Cedar Ridge's northern boundary. "Trail heads that way, but it disappears in the rocks about a mile out. Could be anywhere by now." Emmett nodded grimly, his expression showing the kind of determined resolve that had defined his career as a lawman. "We'll find them. Morrison's on foot, probably armed, and he's got Duke as either a hostage or an accomplice. Either way, he won't get far in that terrain." The search party that assembled within the hour included all 3 marshals, several townspeople who volunteered their assistance, and Emmett himself, armed with his Colt .45 and carrying supplies for an extended pursuit. To anyone watching, it appeared to be a well-organized manhunt for a dangerous escaped prisoner who had taken a valuable military dog with him. The reality was considerably more complex. Morrison was indeed gone, but not as an escapee. He was safely secured in the abandoned mine shaft 2 miles east of town, where Emmett had moved him during the night. The man was unconscious from a carefully administered blow to the head, restrained with rope and guarded by a rattlesnake that Emmett had relocated specifically for that purpose. Morrison would remain there, alive but helpless, until the search party officially gave up their pursuit. As for Duke, he was hidden in a cave system that Emmett had discovered years earlier during one of his solitary rides through the hills. The dog had followed him willingly into concealment, trusting his partner's judgment even when the plan required temporary separation. Food and water were cached in the cave, enough to sustain Duke for several days if necessary. The search proceeded with all the thoroughness that Thompson's professional pride demanded. The trail was followed until it vanished among the rocks, then methodically expanded into a grid pattern that covered several square miles of rough terrain. Emmett participated with apparent dedication, calling Duke's name and examining every possible hiding place with the kind of attention to detail that marked an experienced tracker. But as the hours passed and no trace of either Morrison or Duke was found, the inevitable conclusion began to emerge. The terrain was vast and unforgiving, filled with hidden ravines where a man could disappear forever, and predators that would make short work of anyone who became lost or injured. "It's possible they both went over one of those cliff faces," Thompson said as the afternoon wore on and the search party began to show signs of exhaustion. "Ground's too hard to show blood, but a fall from that height wouldn't leave much to find." Emmett nodded soberly, though his heart was actually lifting with each hour that passed without discovery. The longer the search continued unsuccessfully, the more credible the eventual conclusion would be that both Morrison and Duke had perished in the wilderness. As evening approached and the search party prepared to make camp for the night, Emmett volunteered to take the first watch, positioning himself where he could see the approaches to their campsite, while also keeping an eye on the distant cave, where Duke waited in patient silence. The knife appeared without warning, pressed against his throat from behind, as a familiar voice whispered in his ear, "Thought you were pretty clever, didn't you, old man?" Morrison had somehow escaped from the mine shaft, tracked the search party through miles of difficult terrain, and managed to approach their camp without being detected. The blade at Emmett's throat was sharp enough to draw blood with the slightest pressure, and Morrison's voice carried the kind of desperate fury that made him infinitely more dangerous than he'd been when merely greedy. "Going to call out for help?" Morrison continued, his breath hot against Emmett's ear. "Or are we going to settle this between us, the way it should have been from the beginning?" Emmett remained perfectly still, feeling the knife's edge against his throat and calculating his options with the kind of cold precision that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous encounters. Morrison was behind him, close enough that Emmett could smell the sweat and desperation on the man, but not close enough to prevent movement if the opportunity arose. "Smart of you to move me from that mine," Morrison continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but not smart enough to check for other ways out. Been tracking you for hours, watching you play your little game with the marshals." The knife pressed deeper, drawing a thin line of blood that trickled down Emmett's neck. Morrison's hands were shaking slightly, the tremor of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits and was now operating on pure survival instinct. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison said. "You're going to call that dog of yours out of wherever you've hidden him, and then we're all going to take a little walk away from here. Try anything heroic, and I'll open your throat before you can make a sound." Emmett's mind raced through possibilities, weighing risks and calculating chances. Morrison was desperate enough to kill, but he was also operating without a clear plan beyond immediate escape. The man needed Duke for his original scheme, which meant he wouldn't hurt the dog. But he had no such compunctions about killing anyone who stood in his way. The distant sound of the marshals' voices carried across the rocks, too far away to provide immediate assistance, but close enough that any disturbance would bring them running. The question was whether Emmett could create that disturbance without getting himself killed in the process. "Duke's not coming when you call," Morrison continued, "but he'll come for you. That's what these military dogs do. They protect their handlers, even when it gets them killed." It was then that Emmett heard it, a sound so faint that Morrison missed it entirely, focused as he was on his threats and demands. The soft scrape of claws on rock, moving with the kind of controlled stealth that spoke of professional training and tactical awareness. Duke had left his hiding place and was approaching their position, probably drawn by some instinct that told him his partner was in danger. The dog would be moving carefully, using the terrain for concealment, but he would be coming nonetheless, because that's what good partners did for each other. Emmett made his decision with the swift certainty that had defined the crucial moments of his career. Instead of trying to escape or overpower Morrison, he would trust in the bond he'd built with Duke and the training that had made the dog a military hero. "Duke," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the rocks. "Sheriff's in trouble." Morrison's reaction was immediate and predictable. He jerked the knife away from Emmett's throat to look around for the approaching dog, giving Emmett the split-second opening he needed to throw himself sideways and roll away from the blade. Duke's response was instantaneous and devastating. The dog came over the rocks like a brown and black missile, covering 30 yards of rough terrain in seconds and hitting Morrison with the full force of 80 pounds of trained muscle and controlled aggression. Morrison went down hard, the knife spinning away into the darkness as Duke's weight drove him into the ground. But the criminal was tougher than he looked, rolling with the impact and managing to get his arms up to protect his throat from Duke's snapping jaws. Emmett scrambled to his feet, his hand going automatically to his gun, But the struggle between man and dog was too close and too violent for him to risk a shot. Morrison was fighting for his life, using every dirty trick he knew to try to get leverage on Duke, while the dog employed his military training to control and subdue without killing. The fight might have gone either way, but it was ended by the arrival of Marshal Thompson and his men, drawn by the sounds of combat. Thompson's shot took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him away from Duke and ending the struggle with the kind of decisive force that professional lawmen brought to dangerous situations. Duke immediately disengaged, moving to Emmett's side and positioning himself between his partner and the wounded criminal. The dog's training was evident in how quickly he shifted from combat mode to protective alertness. Ready for further action, but no longer actively engaged, Morrison lay groaning in the dirt, his shoulder bleeding but not life-threatening wounded. Thompson and his men moved to secure the prisoner while Emmett knelt beside Duke, checking the dog for injuries and finding only minor cuts and scrapes that would heal quickly. "Guess this solves our paperwork problem," Thompson said quietly as his men bound Morrison's wounds and prepared him for transport. "Dog's obviously alive and well, and he just helped us recapture an escaped federal prisoner." Emmett looked up at the marshal, understanding immediately what was being offered. With Morrison's recapture under these circumstances, Duke had proven his value as a law enforcement asset. The Army's plans for euthanasia would be much harder to justify when the dog had just demonstrated his continued effectiveness in the field. "Seems like Duke's earned his badge," Emmett said, pinning his sheriff's star firmly back on his chest where it belonged. "Question is whether the federal government recognizes local deputizations." Thompson's smile was answer enough. 6 months later, the brass nameplate beside Emmett's office door gleamed in the morning sunlight, its inscription reading "Deputy Duke" in letters that caught the eye of every visitor to Cedar Ridge. The plate had been Martha's idea, crafted by the blacksmith in Millbrook and installed with the kind of ceremony that small towns reserve for their most important occasions. Emmett sat on his familiar bench, sharing his breakfast with Duke, as had become their established routine. But the scene around them bore little resemblance to the dying town where they'd first met. The railroad's decision to bypass Cedar Ridge had seemed like the end of everything. But the story of the sheriff and his heroic dog had brought a different kind of prosperity to the community. The first change had been subtle, travelers making detours to see the famous duo, staying overnight at the refurbished saloon, and buying supplies from Martha's increasingly well-stocked store. Word spread through the territory about the dog who had solved a murder and helped capture a killer. And with it came curiosity seekers, journalists, and eventually new residents drawn by the town's growing reputation for safety and community spirit. Doc Henley's practice had expanded to include veterinary services, partly to care for Duke but mostly to serve the increasing number of families who brought livestock and pets to their new homes in Cedar Ridge. Father Miguel's church had been renovated with donations from grateful visitors, and his congregation now filled every pew on Sundays. Most significantly, the territorial government had recognized Cedar Ridge as an official sheriff's district, with Emmett's jurisdiction expanded to include the surrounding countryside, and Duke officially commissioned as the first canine deputy in territorial history. The paperwork had taken months to complete, requiring special legislation and federal approval, but Marshal Thompson had proved remarkably effective at navigating bureaucratic obstacles. The Army's response to Duke's new status had been pragmatic rather than punitive. Faced with a media sensation and clear evidence of the dog's continued effectiveness in law enforcement, military officials had quietly agreed to transfer Duke's ownership to the territorial government, officially retiring him from active duty while allowing him to continue his career in civilian law enforcement. This morning's routine was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar wagon, driven by a young couple with 2 small children who had become regular visitors to Cedar Ridge. The family had moved to the territory from back east, drawn by stories of the frontier town where a lonely sheriff and a lost dog had found each other and rebuilt their community in the process. "Morning, Sheriff," called Tom Peterson, waving from the driver's seat while his wife Sarah, she'd been named after Emmett's late wife, a coincidence that had touched him deeply, helped their children down from the wagon. "Morning, Tom," Emmett replied, automatically standing as the family approached. Duke rose as well, his tail wagging with the gentle enthusiasm he reserved for children and familiar friends. The Peterson children, ages 6 and 8, made a beeline for Duke, who submitted to their attention with the patient dignity that had made him a favorite among all the young families in town. Emmett watched the interaction with the kind of contentment that had been missing from his life for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like. "Got those supplies you ordered?" Tom continued, beginning to unload crates from his wagon. "Martha said to tell you the new law books came in too, along with that special collar you commissioned for Duke." The collar was a masterpiece of leatherwork, crafted by the same artisan who made saddles for the territorial governor. It bore Duke's name and rank in silver letters, along with a small badge that matched Emmett's own. More importantly, it contained no references to the dog's previous identity or military service. Duke's past as Rex or his time at Fort Carson had been officially sealed, buried in federal files that would never see the light of day. As Tom finished unloading his wagon and the family prepared to continue their journey to the new homestead they were establishing 10 miles north of town, Emmett reflected on how much their simple act of sharing breakfast had changed everything. A hungry dog's polite request for food had led to friendship, purpose, justice, and ultimately the revival of an entire community. "You know, Duke," he said as they settled back onto their bench to finish their morning meal, "I used to think the best days were behind us. Figured an old sheriff in a dying town didn't have much future to look forward to." Duke's response was the same gentle attention he'd always shown, but now it carried the weight of shared experience and mutual trust that had been tested by danger and proven stronger than any challenge they might face. The approaching sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to a lone rider coming up the main street, and Emmett automatically shifted into professional mode, his hand moving to rest casually on his gun belt while Duke came to alert attention beside him. It was a response born of hard-earned experience and reinforced by months of successful partnership. But as the rider drew closer, Emmett relaxed. It was Deputy Morrison, no relation to the criminal they'd captured, a young man from Millbrook who had requested assignment to Cedar Ridge specifically to work with the famous sheriff and his canine partner. The territory's decision to expand law enforcement in the region had brought new challenges and new responsibilities, but also new allies and renewed purpose. "Morning, Sheriff." "Deputy Duke," Morrison called out as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. "Got the latest reports from the circuit judge and a telegram from the territorial capital." Emmett accepted the documents with the kind of satisfied anticipation that came from knowing his work mattered again, that he and Duke were making a real difference in the lives of the people they served. The lonely old man who had been going through the motions of law enforcement was gone, replaced by someone who had rediscovered his sense of purpose and belonging. As another day began in Cedar Ridge, Emmett looked down at his faithful partner and smiled. Sometimes the loneliest people really did find each other in the most unexpected ways, and when they did, the results could transform not just their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. The brass nameplate caught the morning light, reflecting Deputy Duke in golden letters that promised many more years of partnership, service, and the kind of companionship that made every new day worth celebrating.